Welcome everyone to the third-party risk management webinar hosted by Supply Wisdom. The webinar is about to start. Please use the Q&A button to ask questions or make comments. Please welcome the webinar moderator, Atul Vashis, Chairman of Supply Wisdom and NEO Group, as well as co-chair of the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Business Board.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. By the time this webinar is over in an hour, there will be over 2 million confirmed cases globally of COVID-19. And in the US, that number over 600,000 with over 23,600 deaths in the US. I am fortunate today to have a group of experts to focus on third-party risk and give us their point of view, not just on what's happening today, but how does this move cascade over the next 2 to 3 weeks. With us is Victor Meyer, who's the Global Head of Third-Party Risk Management Remediation Program for Non-Financial Risk at Deutsche Bank. He was also the former Vice Chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Pandemic. We have also with us John Bree, who is the Chief Risk Officer of Supply Wisdom. And prior to Supply Wisdom, he was also part of the third-party risk and vendor risk team at Deutsche Bank. And prior to that, he spent a lot of time globally with Citibank in Asia, in Europe, and other places, again, focused on third-party and anti-money laundering and other such areas. Also with us is the head of data and analytics, Sandeep Suresh of Supply Wisdom. So this is going to be our group of expert panels today. I hope you use the Q&A button to ask questions or to share pieces of information. So let me provide a quick recap beyond the US region. China. Right now, there's a risk of a second wave of infections. You can see on the right that there's other impacts that are cascading. What you're seeing in a graphic is the successive alerts that Supply Wisdom put out to its subscribers as this moved, with the first alert coming out on January 2nd. So you can see on the right the impact that's happening in China. At the same time, in India, what was a lockdown that began on April 14 has now been extended to May 3rd. And again, they're seeing a rise in cases. Similar that we're seeing in the Philippines, where the lockdown has now been extended to April 30th, and it seems that it may go on even further. So you're seeing these constantly changing world where the risk impact is cascading, which is, it is changing. It's not something that happened and stopped and people are responding, it's fundamentally changing. So let me begin with our panelists today. Victor, let's begin with you. You spent several years on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Pandemic, including years as its vice chair. So in what ways is this pandemic similar to how you or your colleagues at the forum envision as a pandemic might develop? And also in what ways, based on the planning that you did, is this different?
Yeah, thanks, Atul. Thanks for the question and for the opportunity to put on a dress shirt for the first time in about a month.
It's a different world, isn't it?
So I guess if you're like me, you've spent an awful lot of time over the last month voraciously consuming information. And so by now everybody's kind of an expert. But I think we need to be a little bit careful there. One of the things that my colleagues and I on the Agenda Council for pandemic and for catastrophic risk as well spend a lot of time doing is defining catastrophic risk, because catastrophic risks are just a little bit different. They are rapid onset. They have, as you just mentioned, cascading effects. I'd like to come back to that in a little bit, but I think one of the most intriguing and one of the things that I think people miss a little bit on catastrophic risks, and in particular pandemic, because of its complexity, is the issue of or the concept of the attribute of novelty. It's a term that was invented by a professor, a colleague on the Agenda Council, named Professor Dutch Leonard at Harvard Business School. And basically, novelty within the context of catastrophic risk is whatever you think you know about a catastrophe is only partially true. So it's a little bit of the aspect of we've never been here before. This is something new under the sun. This is a scale that exceeds our imagination, or it's a combination of emergencies not expected to occur together. And I think the very best example of this is the 2011 Fukushima earthquake and the compromise of the nuclear plant at Fukushima Daiichi. And we invoked global crisis management. We were in the process of trying to dynamically build a scorecard on which we could make decisions. And it was incredibly difficult, but one of the things that we focused on is what was going on inside that reactor. In particular, reactor number 4, which we suspected had a very severe container breach. So we were able to contact through using the power of the forum we were able to contact the head of the engineer, the French engineer that designed reactor number 4. And when I asked him, he says, of course, I have no idea what's going inside this reactor because this is the first time we've had a 1,000-year earthquake. We've had a 10-meter tsunami that's completely compromised the cooling system and potentially breached the nuclear reactor's container. So I have no idea what's going on inside that reactor. That's unknowable. That's the concept of novelty. So we're not even at the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning of this particular crisis. And it's incredibly difficult to even predict which way this thing is going to go and what, not only the scale of the cascading effects, but what are the major components of the cascading events when you look across the time continuum.
So, Victor, you're in a very unique position at Deutsche Bank. You were on the World Economic Forum Pandemic Council, so you were exposed to a lot of this thinking over the years. So how did you take all this thinking? How did you leverage all this knowledge that you have to inform your colleagues or the company's efforts at Deutsche Bank responding to this pandemic today?
So I think there's a couple of things that we kind of got right in terms of the pandemic response, but those conditions and those mechanisms were, of course, put together in the years preceding the pandemic, and it was on the back of Fukushima that was the kind of the wake-up call, because we realized that we couldn't just operate, that we had to monitor. We couldn't just sort of make up a scorecard on the fly, and it had to cover more than just pandemic or than just natural hazard. So I had the fortune to have the business continuity team, the crisis management team, a protective intelligence team that did monitoring for disruptive events, all under my purview at the bank right after Fukushima. And so we designed scorecards across 10 domains of interest, which are, I think some people would call them categories. Other people would call it a broad taxonomy of disruptive events. And we would monitor those on a continuing basis. It was a bottom-up approach, so we had 305 sub-indicators. This is an old scorecard from 2015, so obviously still not confidential, but so 305 sub-indicators, 10 domains of interest. And we would constantly monitor the risk profile of the bank, in particular from a location point of view here. And once we put this in place, we noticed that we in terms of the indications and warnings and trends and patterns, indications and warnings are things that occur quite quickly. Trends and patterns are more gradual, things like demographic or even epidemiological effects, that we were able to have a much better view of kind of how we were monitoring our risks. And so once we had that transparency, we were able to focus on our controls environment and do things that would help prepare us or minimize or reduce the risks. But we also were able to take, as you can see here, this is the Hong Kong scorecard. We were able to see when we had an increased incidence of sickness. And on the back of that, engineer crisis management exercises, scenario-based exercises that we would use to manage all kinds of risks, financial and non-financial. And in this case, we developed a couple of pandemic red team and blue team exercises that helped us, both prepare the operational aspects of the bank, but also just to think about these types of risks and the exposures in a more comprehensive way.
Yeah. And I think, so very much, Victor, when I look at these domains of interest, what stands out to me is the risk categories, for example, that, we leverage at Supply Wisdom. But let me go to John. Sandeep, you're sitting there. I see you on my video perfectly sandwiched between a Navy SEAL at the bottom, Victor Meyer, and on top, what looks like this classic New York or London cop. But so let me go to John Bree. John, I know you spend a lot of time, of course, New York City, London, Tokyo, and when you were part of Citi, when you were part of Deutsche Bank. Talk to us about kind of what Victor just talked about, similar experiences that informed you, particularly areas where risk was not just one time and sudden, but actually lasted and cascaded. Can you talk about your experience, John?
Sure, thank you, Atul. 9/11 comes to mind immediately. I was part of the crisis response team at Citi, and we realized immediately the inability to obtain accurate intelligence as the entire country basically went into various forms of lockdown. Continuity of business and disaster recovery plans basically had to be adjusted on the fly, so to say. This was followed 2 years later by that massive multi-jurisdictional, multi-regional power grid outage, blackout in the US. It was in the Northeast and the Midwest sections of the US. We quickly realized that the continuity of business and disaster recovery plans, which were based on regulatory guidelines back then that were, you had to have your backup site 50 to 100 miles away from your primary site. Well, that didn't work. So we realized, because we had never envisioned this kind of a multi-jurisdictional, shutdown power failure. Location infrastructure risk monitoring may well have provided indications that multiple connected power grids could fail at the same time. Maybe we would be tracking, changeover events or what we call shared responsibility events. That would have helped us be better prepared. It's really location that becomes critical in all this.
Yeah, John, I think it's just this thing also reveals how often companies may have been monitoring risk, but not necessarily thinking about the domino effect. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. No one ever thought of the fallover. Yeah. And ironically, that has happened in normal operating environments with the power companies, but no one ever tracked it.
Yeah. Sandeep, did you want to add anything to that?
So, the only thing that I would like to say is, when you look at these scenarios, and let's keep even the scenarios aside, when you look at even in a normal steady state of things, there is just so much amount of information out there. Most enterprises are collecting, massive amounts of information. They're not just gathering it themselves, but they're also receiving it, inbound from the market, from their suppliers, from many other sources. What is lacking, however, is the filter for relevance and impact.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what we are actually targeting. We combine, I would say, complex automation with AI technologies that removes false positives, but with an additional layer of curation that accounts for relevance and impact. Now, what this does is it clears the clutter. And at especially moments like this, when you need to take decisions quickly, when you need to take action rapidly, having access to that kind of curated intelligence becomes critical.
Yeah, Sandeep, I'm gonna come back to this later because it's one of the biggest questions I'm getting asked right now, is because people are getting these massive amount of feeds but not being able to respond to it. So we're going to revisit that. So I think you've heard the three experts talk about how, in this case, classic example of risk cascading, the domino effect. So I'd like to ask everybody a question. And this is a poll, so the poll is going to come up. Please respond to it. If you are a team member at Neo Group or Supply Wisdom, don't respond to it. I like to be able to see how the audience, those are practitioners, are facing this. So think about the last 2 weeks. particularly the last 2 weeks or so, has your third-party performance deteriorated in the last 2 weeks? So I'm going to make, it's a very yes, no, or unsure question. And I am going to bring this up so that you can vote on it. So again, please respond to, has your third-party performance deteriorated in the last 2 weeks? I'm going to leave it open for another 5 seconds so more people can respond. If you see the poll in front of you, please respond. Okay. So let me end the poll and let's discuss the results. Victor, what jumps out at you?
I always focus on the, you know, I'm a bit of a counterintuitive thinker, so I always focus on the unsure. I'm, on one hand, I'm pleased to see that most of the folks that are participating here today have a good idea of whether their supply chain performance is deteriorating or whether the risk profile is
Yeah.
changing in a positive or negative, more than likely a negative direction. But still, about 10% are kind of unsure. I mean, you can only manage what you can measure.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the biggest thing that stands out, and you know, so one of the audience just send a chat saying the performance deterioration that they've seen is actually only in India, so they haven't seen that in their U.S. operations. So I think this is important, right? That there's a deterioration that companies are seeing in the last 2 weeks, which is telling. And remember, for most, this scenario is at least 4 weeks old. For many, it's 5 to 6 weeks old. So they are seeing a negative impact on this. Again, I'll ask another question later on, but this makes an important point that we are actually seeing a challenge. Let me move to the next question. So one of the control risks that we saw in this whole work from home, I was talking to a CISO at a bank who went from a few thousand people having the capability to work from home to 60,000 in 2 weeks. And in another week, they took it to 250,000, right? And in many cases, in many places, not a secure environment. In many cases, companies had to let people use their own devices. So not having the same security install that they would on their own VPN and the company-owned devices. So one of the control risks we saw related from home was people are in what would be called non-defined areas, right? Their homes, because that's what becomes their workplace. So John, why don't we begin with you? How are you and other enterprises, or how are you seeing other enterprises account for this risk, whether it's cyber or basic security on devices?
Well, with the rapid expansion, I mean, an unplanned expansion of connectivity, which you just mentioned from third-party staff, putting your own staff on with devices that meet your protocols is relatively okay. The challenge is when you have devices that don't meet your security protocols. Many third-party service providers were not prepared to have people work from home. So it was kind of a rapid change. People were taking laptops. Some people took desktops home to work from. Now, in the home environment, we get spoiled in certain countries, but in a lot of countries, the connectivity is unstable, the power is unreliable. And the other problem is that you don't have security on that end device. You can't put an agent out. So working with our cyber partner, we actually developed a two-tier solution that we're working with clients on. One is called a passive IP intelligence. And really it's a passive lookup for an IP address contained in our, we have a continuously updated cyber intelligence database. No end user activity is required. And basically you get threat intelligence data that includes things like botnet activity, malware, unsolicited communications, aggressive port scan, torrent download, among others. And then we expanded that into what's called a self-service network hygiene check. And in this case, the self-service website is enabled and an end user to do a simple check. They go to the website, they go to the URL, they visit the URL for self-service cyber hygiene check, and they get their results immediately. Now, the nice part is that whoever is administrating this on behalf of a company can actually see who's a high-risk user and react to that. So these are some things that are developing quickly as the need has risen.
Right, that's interesting. I think so. We are definitely seeing new solutions, whether it's Supply Wisdom or other companies responding to that. I know, Sandeep, you wanted to jump in on this one.
Yeah, I did actually. So, listening to John, he just touched upon multiple areas and categories that are impacting, third parties' ability to deliver services. That's why our risk model has 14 different categories. And we are not just assessing third parties and locations on these categories, but we are monitoring them on an ongoing basis. We were very clear that we had to go far just beyond financials when it comes to third parties. And now with situations like this, you are seeing a simple concept of working from home actually having a multi-dimensional impact that is driven not just from the third parties themselves, but also from the locations that their people are working from. You have risks that are related to their ability to work securely. You also have the risks that have that impact whether or not they can get these equipment. Remember, different locations have different degrees of lockdowns in place right now. So all of these factors are now going into making sure that if you need to have a proactive mitigation plan, you need to have an overarching monitoring mechanism that does not focus on one category, but you're looking at a multi-dimensional impact that you can make sense out of.
Yeah, I think for me, this has reinforced the importance that you can't just monitor cyber, you have to monitor, and not just financials, but solution maturity. I mean, we're seeing companies, I just had a comment, for example, from a bank in Ireland, one of their leaders that focuses on third-party risk and business continuity. And he's making the point that, hey, for some of our suppliers, they had to stop their business as usual activities so that they could focus on the more key important activities, right? And based on that, the responsiveness of suppliers and their flexibility has been very impressive. But many companies have had to make that decision both for internal processes, and the supplier has to make that decision, same thing for there. And that, to me, is an example of solution maturity. Which solution was mature enough to be able to done remotely, to be done in many cases from home, and meet some of the security requirements that were needed. Similarly, are you still in compliance with some of the changes that the local government's authorities have made where you were, the governance, regulatory compliance? And then what is the impact on people, right? So the people aspect as monitoring risk. And then from a client perspective, how are these third parties, companies clients responding to it? And I think the same thing that I'm noticing with location risk in terms of where not just important to look at what's happening in terms of this disruptive aspect of a pandemic, but infrastructure, laws that are changing dramatically during this period. The action some governments are taking in terms of some leaders literally seizing power and making fundamental changes. So definitely, a lot that's changing. Let me switch to Victor to ask the next question, and then Victor, after that, I want to do this poll. But let me ask you the next question first. So Victor, I know that you recently, when I was talking to you a few months ago, you had taken the help of a Big Four consulting firm and done a comprehensive analysis of Deutsche Bank's future state TPRM model. I love that saying from Mike Tyson, right? Everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. And COVID-19 reminds me of that, right? So think about that experience that you just went through. You're going through a response to COVID-19. What is going to change in your plan? And number two, what do you think is the next shoe to drop?
Yeah, thanks, Atul. Yeah, I thought that we had a pretty comprehensive approach with this Big Four consultancy, and one of the things they did was a benchmarking. But then on the back of that benchmarking, I conducted about 20 interviews with heads of TPRM across the industry. They were very, very forthcoming about the strengths and weaknesses of their models. And so our solution was, which we had not really started to implement yet. It's still in the design stage, but it was informed by their views and their insights. But I think this obviously has stress tested that model, and there are 2 points I think that we're going to have to go back in and design into or enshrine in the future state model that received probably not as much attention as they should have. The first is the fact that we need to be able to manage these risks on a more dynamic basis, because the third party piece has to feed directly into the crisis management process, and decision makers need to have almost a dashboard of where the changes, negative changes or deterioration in the risk profile across the supplier population are, so that again, so that they can be addressed. I'm a huge believer in Sutcliffe and White's characteristics of highly resilient organizations, to the ability to respond decisively to weak signals, to get on top of it, perhaps take on another supplier. But so the ability to feed directly into the crisis management, to have decision makers to give decision makers access to the risk profile on an ongoing basis, and have it constantly updated.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is that there's been a disproportionate focus on the front end of the supplier life cycle, and that is the approvals, and not enough attention to the ongoing monitoring. So, and this, you've got a lot of firms that are doing sort of emergency onboarding of third parties, where in particular information security controls may not be completely validated, and findings not so there may be risk exposures that you wouldn't ordinarily accept in a business as usual, that you would accept in order to get that capability into the firm. But that it increases the imperative now because the deterioration is accelerated by this pandemic. And suppliers risk profiles are changing on a much more rapid basis than perhaps we appreciated in which we designed for. In terms of the next shoe to drop, I think it's almost a given that certain suppliers will struggle operationally. And you have to look at this. There's certain things they can sustain for 3 or 5 or 10 days that won't be sustainable for 15 or 20 or during successive waves. And I think that's, if not understood, at least recognized. And again, I would apply the novelty to that, and be a bit circumspect about anybody that said that they had an absolute comprehensive view of their risk, supplier risk profile. But I was talking with one of my former business school professors at NYU, the Stern School, named Ed Altman, and he was the guy that invented the Z-score, which is one of the very first models for predicting corporate insolvency. And he said to me, he goes, "Look, I'm quite worried because low interest rates have resulted in firms taking on an awful lot of debt, and now all of a sudden we've pulled the revenue rug out from under those firms." And he goes, "I predict a higher rate of insolvencies than we saw during the financial crisis." And I think the next shoe to drop is suppliers and the fourth and fifth parties insolvencies, and the result of that's very, very difficult to predict.
Yeah, I've been preaching this whole aspect of ongoing monitoring, real-time monitoring, continuous monitoring. And I remember being at a conference about a year ago on a panel for continuous monitoring, and this one panelist was talking about how every quarter, every year, kind of an assessment was defined as continuous monitoring because it was on a continuous basis. It happens to be a quarter, and that does not fly. and we've been talking about it for a long period of time. Continuous means real time, every day, not every day, every minute, literally. And we can see in this case how that's been really important. Sandeep, I know when I was talking to you about this question earlier, you wanted to jump in on this one.
Well, so, just taking Victor's point ahead, Atul, it's when it comes to continuous monitoring and intelligence, having the right kind of intelligence becomes critical. Now, when I say the right kind of intelligence, what I mean by that is, yes, oftentimes you need to see the bigger picture, but at many times you have to dig deeper and go down to granular levels. Only because even within your own portfolio of third parties, you will see differences at granular levels. Victor spoke about deteriorating financial health, right? So within that financial health, it becomes important for you to understand what those levers are. Which are your third parties that are, like he said, high on debt? Which are the third parties that are low on liquidity? Who are the ones who have weak balance sheet ratios? That becomes important. Everybody is focusing on locations right now. Again, there are nuances, there are differences right over there as well. It is not enough now to be monitoring, at a regional level, or in many cases, even at a country level, simply because within the similar region, this has impacted countries differently. And more importantly, these countries have taken different paths to combat this pandemic. Even within a single country, you have different cities that are on different paths of the road to recovery. So having this intelligence is what will truly give you a sense of the road to recovery of your third parties, and most importantly, the timing. Lockdowns, like Atul showed you a few examples right at the beginning. Different countries have different impact levels. There are, the number of cases are rising, peaking, and throwing at different aspects. So all of this is going to have an impact on the ability for your third party to bounce back.
Yeah, I would like to just pick up on that for just 1 second. It reminds me of I'm very fond of a quote by a British general named Reginald Victor Jones. He was basically the founder of the modern scientific intelligence, and many people attribute his analysis to Britain's victory during the Battle of Britain. He says, "Before I will believe what I want to believe, I need to know what I need to know." And that's exactly the point, Sandeep, that you just spoke to.
Yeah. John, did you want to add to that question, or?
Yeah, I did. It's interesting to listen to this, and having spent so many years in the financial industry and other regulated industries, we monitor things on a continuous basis in other parts of our businesses. We monitor client behavior, we monitor customer behavior, transactions. It's continuous. It's how we operate, how we can react and make decisions quickly. Ironically, we don't do that when we look at our third-party service providers and even some of our own captives. Episodic point in time, 500 to 1,000 question assessments, they're not designed to keep pace with the expedited world of agile and DevOps. If products are being rolled out in 3 months and you're taking 6 months to do a risk assessment, you're having a negative impact on the business. And controls, governance, and compliance really are there to empower the business to succeed, not to prevent it from succeeding. So more to the point, in a crisis situation such as COVID-19, a global shutdown of vendor health reports, right? So you have the global shutdown. Vendor health reports from December 31st, 2019 have no really impact on your decision making. They're old news. It's where a company was and where they thought they were going in what was basically a thriving global economy. You need current, validated, and actionable intelligence, which is provided either through alerts or a continuous update to a risk score, so that you can make sound tactical adjustments. Because remember, your tactical adjustments have to be designed in such a fashion that you can eventually get back to normal. You can't completely disrupt. So I think that having real-time, continuous, validated information is what's going to be critical to moving forward in this environment.
Yeah. So I have a number of questions that have come up that I want to jump to, but let me do this. Let me do the poll, and then I'm going to jump to some of these questions that have come up because it really makes sense at the next part. So everybody, get your polling thinking on, and I'm going to make sure that I will bring up these other questions later. So the question is that I'd like you all to please answer when I bring the poll up is, how confident are you in your ability to monitor your third party's changing risk profile? Remember, we've talked about cascading risk, the domino effect, and how health is deteriorating. How confident are you in your ability to monitor your third party's changing risk profile? Let me go to the question. And again, I would ask Neo Group and Supply Wisdom team members, please do not respond. So the polling is open. Please respond. How confident are you in your ability, or your department or your company's ability, to monitor your third party's changing risk profile? If you want to, I will give another couple of seconds while a few more people are joining in. Do a few more of you want to vote? Okay, 2 more seconds. And let me end the poll. All right. Let me share the results. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. So interestingly, I think, again, John, when you see this, what jumps out at you in terms of people's confidence in their ability to monitor what's changing?
Well, 2/3 of people are unsure. And that's what it tells me right here. I mean, I think I'll be okay, and not confident at all. That's where we're seeing it. The fact that a third of the respondents have a reasonable level of confidence, I think that's a good sign. But then again, it's according to how large their vendor portfolio is.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with 10,000 or 15,000 vendors, it might change. But it shows that there's a need to get better at this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So, it tells you that it's good news is there's some maturing we're seeing in certain programs at the same time as we have seen the market recognizing that there is significant opportunity for improvement. Let me move on to the next slide. But as I do that, I want to use some of the points that are being made. So one of the questions, and whoever wants to jump in, feel free to do that between the three of you, is that, I think for a lot of companies, their TPRM teams are small, but they have global vendor populations. And the need for continuous monitoring has become very clear to them today. May not have been before this, but it's very clear to them today. So what they're saying is, as they're signing up for continuous monitoring from any solution provider, who is owning that continuous monitoring? Is it the business relationship owner, or is it in the centralized risk team?
Let me jump in on that one just from the beginning, because what I'm seeing that companies are realizing the value of combining real-time, curated vendor risk intelligence with location intelligence. So things we were talking about is, what about the company? What about where they're operating from? That's important. The other thing is that, vendor X may have a great business continuity plan, but it's only effective if where the jurisdictions are open to business. So when you take all that into consideration, it really can be used across. You have the front line or the level 1 operating group that's in constant contact with the vendor, and they need real-time data to help those decisions. And then you have the second level, or the governance group, or the oversight group, that needs intelligence so that they can validate that controls are reasonably still in place. I think we're also going to see a kind of a rapid move to what we call steady state risk operation centers, where you have that listening post that we talk about. And I think you see it on the diagram, where information is coming in all the time and it's constantly going out. It becomes part of the standard operating procedures of an organization. It's not something that only happens when they're in trouble.
So John, the other part of the question that I'd like you to answer, and then Victor, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on it also. John, who is owning this continuous monitoring? Where do you see it? Is it the centralized risk team, or in the business that has relationship with that third party?
I see it primarily in the risk team, because they can use it, but then, and they're sharing it then with other operational functions.
And how are you seeing it being managed? You know, how are they delegating the responsibilities across the team and not getting overwhelmed by it?
Well, a lot of times they're relying on a third party to provide risk analysis. In other words, you know, you have this massive amount of data coming in. So instead of building your own internal team, they're looking to, you know, specialists in risk and analytics to then pull it together and give them, you know, unique information based on their environment, their structure. A bank is different than a manufacturing company, which is maybe different than, you know, an asset management company. Right. And you can't all set up your team. So I think we're seeing, we're going to see an increase in specialized third-party vendors providing risk intelligence and risk analytics.
So Victor or Sandeep, if you can jump on this, and then as you talk about it from one of the business leaders in healthcare and other in banking, one of the questions they're saying is, talk about how is, you know, this continuous monitoring flowing into actionable data, and then how are prioritizing and remediating control weaknesses? How is that process you think works well, or what would be the good way to make it work well?
So I can respond directly to the question that you just asked, John, and that is, in my discussions, first on who is and who should be managing the vendor relationship. I know that from a regulatory point of view, I don't think the regulators are necessarily averse to the so-called division managed approach, but they certainly expect one single firm-wide view of the risk profile of the bank, or in our case, the bank. And that's there's that's a zero compromise viewpoint from the regulators that I've spoken with as late as February. The second thing in the same conversation is a realization by the regulator, an expectation by the regulators that they want quote real-time intelligence-led monitoring of suppliers, end of quote.
Yeah. So, you know, maybe I'll add a little bit because many of these questions have a relationship to kind of how are you managing this additional oversight, this extra oversight that's being needed. And I just, you know, this was a white paper that Supply Wisdom published, I think about a week or maybe 2 weeks ago. And I think it's important to think about is that the continuous monitoring piece that everybody's talking about, that's a listening post. That's where you have all this real-time intelligence coming in, hopefully from a company or an effort that you have in place where the risk framework is very comprehensive, so it has all the risks we were talking about, and not just finance and cyber, and not just at a point in time. It's real-time that's coming in. And there's a method and an approach to make it actionable. What does that mean? What that means is that how is that assessed quickly to say, what's the impact to my operations? Is it an internal impact, or is it to my third party that impacts me? What is the right response to it? And that's the response center. In many cases, companies are outsourcing it to risk analyst as a service, whether it's to somebody like Supply Wisdom or a Big Four, where the listening post kind of flows into the response center. The response center has these playbooks. And in many cases, these playbooks are being updated right now, and they're getting updated literally every week, where you have a response that takes place. The response is either internal or the response is external by your third party. And we recommend that you think about this response center work as these 9 work streams, right? One needs to monitor how the issue is progressing. What is the impact on the workforce? Is my technology available and ready? What's happening to the location where this work is being done? What impact is happening to the financial health of myself and my third parties? Are the authorities, which is the governments, whether it's city, county, state, country, are they making different decisions? Are they changing? Is it different today than it was last week? What's happened to the facilities that I had some of my people working? We're noticing in some industries, anywhere from 20 to 50% of the people are still working and going into the office. They're maintaining the social distancing, but what's happening to the health of those facilities? Of course, we have locations like hospitals, grocery stores, and others that are still functioning. And then specific focus on the third parties and how is their health deteriorating? What's their response been? How do we prioritize what resources are key, what processes are key, what technologies and services are key? And then finally, to be able to communicate all this so that there isn't any kind of confusion. And all this then feeding back to all the business functions, and again, kind of remediation or redoing of these playbooks. I'm going to stop there to see if you guys have any comment before I ask my next question, but I also have a follow-on from one of the comments from one of the business leaders from a large healthcare insurance company. John, Sandeep?
One of the things to consider, and I think you raise a really critical point here, and that's that second horizontal arrow, which is about action. The hidden risk is, we all went back to, I don't know what I don't know, and then you know what you don't know, and so on. One of the things to think about is once you know, knowing and not acting is really a serious situation. That's a hidden risk. So a lot of times data is coming into an organization, but if they don't have a formal way to process it and then turn it into an actionable intelligence, it just sits there, and then you look back and you say, well, gee, why didn't anybody do anything about this?
Yeah.
100% agree, John. And one of the biggest gaps that we see in today's scenario of especially the existing operations center is not having a structured listening post in place. Oftentimes, if you have to figure out what intelligence you need to be consuming by sifting through the noise, you are spending a lot of time before you can even figure out what action needs to be taken.
Right.
Having a structured way of receiving this intelligence, right at the beginning, where, you're ensuring that false positives are eliminated, you're filtering it out for whether or not this is relevant to you, you're filtering out the impact levels, allows you to take that action quickly, rapidly, and when scenarios are changing literally every day, that becomes even more critical.
Yeah. So, one of the questions from an audience, and Victor, to you first. In this current situation, what was the immediate action you took when this threat was recognized as real? What was the first action that Deutsche Bank took?
I think that we have a significant presence in Asia. And so having been through the pandemic exercises, there was still some muscle memory in place. There were some senior leaders that knew how to respond, and so the whole thing sort of was mobilized very, very quickly. And the members of the crisis management team had been well trained, and actually in Asia Pacific, they're exposed to basically a crisis a week there. So it was I think it was almost seamless. Where I think it probably could have been a bit better, if I'm honest, is mobilizing globally. So the whole thing should have been a little bit more of a seamless mobilization across the entire firm. It was seen as this is kind of an Asia problem. But again, we were a victim of the novelty effect. No one had ever really seen. The last pandemic was a bit of a damp squib, the H1N1 pandemic. So no one, people were used to epidemics, SARS, MERS, Ebola, et cetera, but nobody had given really serious thought to a pandemic. And so novelty caught us out.
So John, you are, as chief evangelist and chief risk officer, Supply Wisdom, you talk to a number of banks, insurance, you name it, right? Pretty much every week. Talk about what was some of the first reactions you saw those companies take?
Well, immediately, I think, like Victor said, a lot of companies mobilized and they went immediately to their remote working and work from home, and that was fine. Then they realized very quickly the challenge with third-party vendors, service providers, that never anticipated having to work from another location. That was a really serious issue. And, you know, some of these are non-critical functions, but some of them are critical functions. You know, you're in financial industry. I mean, settlement is where you live and die. And if you can't get settlement done timely, customers are not going to be satisfied, and you could have a serious exposure. So I think
John,
what happened.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So John, okay, I think I want us to get to the point, because one of the first things that I saw, for example, from one of the banking customers was an attestation of impact, right? Whether it's like, where's your employees? And they did the same thing internally. Where are you? What's your health condition? And many of them are continuing to do this. So that employee and third-party attestation was one of the first steps they did, right?
Yeah, that's standard continuity of business. My point is, it was fine for their own employees. But think about the dependency on staff that you don't directly control or manage or have connections with.
Right. So
that's the problem.
So, sorry, John. I want to make sure you guys are answering my specific question, because that's a question from the audience, is what was the first set of actions you saw companies take? Sandeep, do you want to add to that, or have we kind of answered that already?
Well, you know, I would probably go just along the lines of what John said is, you know, step one, you know, given the fact that this entire episode was playing out based off people coming in, traveling to different geographies. So you're absolutely right. That was the first step that even we saw a lot of our clients take in terms of making sure or understanding not just the physical location, but the physical well-being of their employees. They then got to do the same thing, the same exact activity from their third parties. And that's when the problem started unfolding in terms of, do you have access to infrastructure? Do you have access to the clearance? And that's where, you know, I earlier spoke about the location level intelligence. What they realized is some cities had very different dynamics. Even though their people were you know, meant to go to work, they were not allowed to go to work because the lockdown restrictions were much higher. In certain other cities, scalability was an issue. They simply did not have access to that many number of laptops you know, in a single go, because the demand was very high for a lot of people. So from our own personal experience, I can say that it was about attestation, protection of their people, ensuring about whether or not the infrastructure was in place, and then figuring out whether the clearance was there or not for these people to be providing.
Yes, I think I understand a little bit more the question now, Atul. So we do, I mean, on the back of the crisis management exercises that we ran, you know, we developed a pretty comprehensive pandemic, you called it a playbook, pandemic response plan. And it was by phase of the pandemic. It links back to the WHO phases. And although the WHO had issues with the H1N1 and totally revamped that, it's still, the second time around, was suboptimal. But I think more important than that is a fact of, we had made some bad assumptions that the regulators would never let traders, for example, operate from, you know, work from home. So we had to do that, or we have to do, we're doing it now. So there's a whole litany of technology and compliance issues associated with that we just never, we'd almost, you know, made some assumptions in the exercise and in the plans, and they were bad assumptions. Yeah. So we had to really retool to increase. We never, you know, we said we'll do social distancing. I don't think anybody envisioned the entire workforce globally working from home, and to have the necessary infrastructure to support that.
So
latency and electronic trading systems and all, as you move the operator further away from the data center, all these issues were never anticipated.
So we have 4 minutes left. Let me just share a quick story, and then I have a final question. So I was talking to the chief risk officer of one of the large insurance companies last week, and I was probing him for some of this very questions, like what is he doing now that's critical? Two things stood out for me. One was they've absolutely prioritized in terms of what are their most critical system, most critical people, And so they know if absenteeism rises or challenges rise, they know what to turn off, as one of our early attendees asked the question. Second is, their original list of critical third parties was about 300. He's come to the realization is that in the response to COVID, there's about 40 that they really, really care about right now. And that's the one that he's immediately putting continuous monitoring on. So I think it's important that we're definitely seeing reactions like that. Let me move to the final kind of point that I would like you guys to add to is, so think about, Victor, you've seen this at, you're experiencing this at Deutsche Bank. Sandeep and John, you're experiencing this at, tens of companies, right? In terms of how they're responding. So talk to us about, because when I asked you this question in preparing for this panel, you guys came back with these points, and maybe Victor, quickly you can go on. We have about 3 minutes. What are the components of the right solution based on what you have learned in this response?
Well, I think I'll occasionally have a very, what I would consider a formative discussion about risk management as a discipline. And I had one a couple of years ago with Dmitry Alperovich. He was one of the co-founders of CrowdStrike. And he said, look, people make cybersecurity a lot harder than it has to be. There's only really 3 things you can do. You can focus on intelligence, you can focus on the integrity and the maturity of your defenses, or you could focus on consequence management. And he said, but this applies to a broader taxonomy, or you can take an all hazards approach to this. Because I think back to the point that that was made earlier, John weighed in on the Risk Operations Center. As firms get increasingly complex, we need to apply that methodology to an all hazards approach, but we need to give a little bit more attention to the intelligence piece and extend that to the network of suppliers and third parties, and as well the consequence management piece, because it takes a lot of discipline to run a good crisis management program, but systems and people do fail. And so inevitably, like Dimitri said, you've got to design you have to design your operating system. It's like your defenses are like body armor that is going to fail, like one out of every 25 times, and you got to be ready to triage.
Yeah. I think what stands out for me in all this discussion is that what used to be often seen as a cost center, as a necessary investment, which is risk management, especially third-party risk management, is clearly being recognized as a competitive advantage. The companies who've been able to manage this risk are doing better. The third parties who have been able to manage this risk are doing better, and they will, in the long run, right? Once this is over, you move on, they will be the ones that benefit from it. So we're at the end of our webinar. Victor, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your experience, not just from your days at Deutsche Bank, but also from your experience being on the World Economic Forum. John, thank you so much for sharing your experience from your days at Deutsche Bank and Citi, and now at Supply Wisdom. And Sandeep, thank you again for sharing your experiences as you lead the operations and research at Supply Wisdom.